One thing that elevates Morrowind above other Elder Scrolls titles, at least in my book, is the alien setting. In comparison, Cyrodiil as seen in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion is green and medieval, and thus often called out as a mere traditional sword and sorcery Western fantasy. Skyrim is also more grounded and realistic, although somewhat grittier and desaturated. We can even go back to an archaic age of the 90s, and the second installment of the series, Daggerfall, which was, while in many ways groundbreaking, still set in a standard fantasy setting. All of these titles, Daggerfall, Oblivion, and Skyrim, for the most part portray a predominantly human culture with familiar elements. We see walled cities and castles, wander through green hills and forests, and fight real-life predators like wolves, bears, and, well, trolls. Things that are pretty much standard in conventional fantasy setting. For me, that was never a problem. Just because Oblivion is, quote, typical Western European fantasy, doesn't mean that it's bad or boring. I, for once, love medieval or pre-modern environments in games. Point that I'm trying to make, although this is something already well known, is that Morrowind is a very different Elder Scrolls game. For once, game is set in the land of Dunmer or Dark Elves, an old and highly complex society, specifically on Wardenfell or a Black Isle, an island dominated by the great volcano Red Mountain. It is characterized by arid wastes, rocky highlands, and coastal wetlands filled with unusual and unique flora and fauna. Giant mushrooms and dead trees dominate the landscape, inhabited by strange otherworldly creatures like Kaguti, Guar, Nixhounds, or extremely aggressive cliff racers. There are no horses or wolves to be found, only these strange life forms that somehow feel equally as real. Today, however, I will focus on one specific aspect of Morrowind that I always admired: architecture. It's something I have always had an interest in. Going back to my earliest gaming days, I remember being fascinated by the level designs in the original Spyro the Dragon trilogy. They were so vivid and fantastical, yet clearly inspired by real-life locations. They made me wander through cleared-out levels, imagining what kind of society would live there and what would their daily life be like. I was so invested in design and use of space in video games. Another game that sparked my interest in world building was Warcraft 3, released in 2002, same year as Morrowind. I particularly loved human architecture and overall aesthetics, which reminded me a lot of medieval France and Germany. And then Morrowind came and, in my mind, elevated the concept of world building to a whole new level. There were no more colorful, cartoonish settlements, but bizarre and atypical structures that were at the same time set within a game in a meaningful and practical way. There was a strong sense of realism in Morrowind, contrasted to the deliberate and realistic and high fantasy approach of games like Warcraft. For example, giant mushroom towers found in the eastern portions of Wardenfell and inhabited by the wizard lords of House Telvanni, if done wrong, could have been so easily portrayed in a ridiculous, corny way, yet they became iconic symbols of not only Morrowind, but I'd say entire series. As I explored newly discovered world of Wardenfell, I learned a lot about Dunmer culture and society just by observing their structures. And this is indeed a crucial role of architecture when it comes to world building. Silent storytelling. It's an art form and a way to express ideas visually. Before I start, I just want to mention that I'm in no way an expert, but in this video I will try to provide my own comment on various architectural styles found in game, from a standpoint of a mere casual fan. I will discuss not only their style, but real-life equivalents and inspirations. So thank you for joining me once again. My name is Alec, and this is episode 5 of Let's Overanalyze Morrowind. One of the qualities of Morrowind is the way game gradually introduces its weird and alien elements. First buildings we see in game as we enter Seyda Inn are simple shacks and rather generic medieval houses. Then we are tasked to travel to Balmora, and we can either walk there or use a Siltstrider to fast travel. If we choose to walk, and this is my preferred option, along the road we will stumble upon a small farming village of Pelagiad.
What brings you here to Pelagiad?
Again, nothing unusual or weird, just a bunch of more medieval, generic but quite pleasing looking houses, this time grouped around a fort. It's only upon arriving in Balmora that we start witnessing game's otherworldly aspects, at least in regards to architecture. But even here, it's nothing too wild. Balmora feels peaceful and has a strong welcoming vibe with smooth, simple houses, perfectly ordered on both sides of the Odail River. It's only after we venture further into the province that we begin to realize the true alien nature of Vvardenfell. Before I start talking about each style separately, I will mention that Vvardenfell, for a supposedly isolated and inhospitable land, is surprisingly diverse. Besides foreign cultures such as Imperial and Nordic that do have a presence, even the native Dunmer culture is branched into various styles based on political or ideological background. Each great house has a different architectural style that reflects its ideology, philosophy, or even a lifestyle. And then there are Ashlanders with their own nomadic tribal culture, as well as religious temple complexes and remnants of ancient history found in scattered and mostly forgotten Veloti towers, Dunmer strongholds, and finally, Daedric and Dwemer ruins. There is a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right into it. I believe that there is an unwritten rule that every fantasy world, no matter how alien may be, has to contain a familiar mundane element, whether it's a faction or an architectural style. In case of Morrowind, as I already mentioned, game's early stage has a conveniently toned down fantastic aspect. Player is greeted with simple wooden shacks and plain Western-style houses, creating a safe, familiar environment as a starting point for the adventure. So what can we say about these typically medieval houses? Well, first of all human or Western colonial settlements on Vvardenfell are fairly new. Game is set in the year 427 and Vvardenfell was opened for settlement only 13 years prior, in 414. Let's take for example a village of Pelagiad. Hear what the game has to say about it. The Empire built a little fort here to guard the roads between Vivec, Seydanin, Balmora and points north. And then some veterans took their mustering out pay and built themselves some little farms here. And pretty soon there's a few shops and a trade house. It's a pleasant little village. If you didn't know better, you'd think you were in Daggerfall or some other high rock town. Game also specifies this style as Western Imperial, which could simply be another term for a high rock, since high rock is a Western Imperial province. I always liked this style even though it's largely considered generic, especially the larger houses that are often used as shops or taverns. They remind me a lot of traditional Tudor style. While smaller ones are quite simple with walls made of stone and hay-based roofs, larger Tudor-like structures include half-timber framing. We can see almost exact style in Cyrodiil, for example in Shading Hall. What's funny is that Shading Hall is described as containing heavy Dunmer influence on culture and architecture, while in game, city looks pretty much like any Imperial town in Morrowind, with typical Western Imperial style. However, if I had to guess, perhaps overall sharpness, pointy rooftops, and slight purple hues have to do something with the Dunmer influences. Also, could this mean that western portion of the mainland Morrowind is, at least at this time, heavily westernized? So this particular style is not considered Dunmer, or is at least adopted by them. It's kinda confusing, but in any case, there is no confusion when it comes to Vvardenfell, and towns like Pelagiad and Caldera are clearly considered Western Imperial. Speaking of the Empire, there are several forts dispersed across the island, especially on the western half. These are standard military forts, quite solid and well fortified, usually containing barracks, chapels, armorers, and offices. Legion is obviously influenced by the ancient Roman aesthetics, with some medieval elements. For example, higher-ranking members are called knights. It's a very interesting syncretism that I personally like a lot, and I have to say that out of all the Elder Scrolls games that I played, Morrowind's version of the Imperial Legion is my favorite. My guess would be that these forts are logically somewhat influenced by real-life Roman forts. Although Romans built mostly wooden camps, in later period they did build some permanent stone fortifications, especially in violent, hostile lands. and sometimes villages and towns would gradually grow around them, just like Pelagiat or Caldera, attracting traders of all kinds as well as farmers and citizens who very much preferred safety provided by well-equipped and trained guardsmen. The largest and most influential imperial city on Vardenfell is definitely Ebonheart. As the seat of the imperial authority, it contains not only a garrison but also a grand council hall as well as the headquarters of the imperial cult and Eastern Empire Company. There is also a dragon square named, of course, after the marvelous statue of a dragon, a symbol of the empire. In this segment, I also want to touch upon coastal shack villages. Even though they do not belong to the imperial style, they are often mixed in with the other styles. And like in Sedanin, they are mixed in with the western houses as well. Wooden shacks are truly most generic and most affordable dwelling places in Morrowind, not counting caves and other natural habitats. However, they do have a certain charm, especially when mixed with, like I said, other architectural styles. There are few of these fishing villages nested along the Bitter Coast, a largely uninhabited and quite dangerous area. These tiny settlements are underwhelming, uninspiring, mundane, devoid of any fun content. In short, they are inconsequential, just as they should be. Players have very few reasons to visit them. Few traders that can be found there are poor and offer low-value items. Yet there is a charm to them. They make the world feel alive, since not every town has to be filled with intriguing content. It's a world on its own that lives throughout each day, far from all the drama and politics of the big cities. And some of my favorite sunset moments are captured along the Bitter Coast. To summarize, wooden shacks fit quite well in this region, perfectly blending in with the green salty marshes. And before we move on, in order to complete the catalog of human architecture, we should mention Raven Rock, a settlement created by the East Empire Company on the island of Solstheim. There is really nothing much to be said about it, except that houses are just regular wooden structures compared to half-timber ones found on Vardenfell. It was most likely a designer's choice to make these houses somewhat different. They do feel quite cozy among the snow-covered pine trees. Okay, now we are getting into the main segment of today's video. Dunmer in general tend to use organic materials in their designs, whether to build structures or craft various items. They draw inspiration from environment, like Telvanni using giant mushrooms or Redrun with their insectoid-inspired aesthetics. First, we're gonna cover 3 great houses present in the game. Most players discover Hlalu first, since Balmora is the nominal seat of this house, as well as the second largest city on Vardenfell, right after Vivec. Hlalu means stonewood or stone forest, as it's supposed to be this large composition of blocky structures spreading all along the Odai River in squares and straight lines. I believe that the nice open view of Balmora upon entering, especially for the first time, is a major reason why so many players love the city and feel like at home here. There is nothing aggressive or threatening in both architectural style and urban design. On the contrary, Balmora feels safe and welcoming. In one way, Hlalu can be viewed as a somewhat modernized Velotti style. It's a mud brick architecture with external stairways leading up to a second-story entrance, or sometimes to a furnished roof. Houses are very simple, compact, blocky and smooth, and almost universally yellow-colored. Out of all 3 great houses, Hlalu has the most mundane-looking architecture. Personally, I don't dislike it, but also don't particularly like it either. I think average is the right word to describe it, and the same goes for both exterior and interior. In my opinion, Hlalu lacks the noble aesthetics found especially in the Redrun interiors. Hlalu is, after all, a merchant-oriented house, and their architecture is foremost practical. And while we are in Balmora, I want to mention these 2 Western Guard towers, as they finally add some highly needed verticality in a predominantly horizontal layout. It's a very nice touch and makes a huge difference. I can only imagine a large-scale Balmora with more of these towers placed around and countless small, busy streets. It does have a certain Middle Eastern aspect. As for the real-life inspirations, this kind of architecture is found in few places around the globe. Most agree that it's similar to Adobe style, which is Spanish for mud brick, found in northern and western Africa as well as in Pueblo architecture of North American Southwest. There is also a similarity with the Cycladic architecture found on Greek islands, with its very basic and cubic form. Now, one characteristic of Cycladic houses is that they are completely white. And coincidentally, there is a mod called White Suran, which I use for a very long time and recommend, and it does just what it says. It turns Suran's Hlalu houses white, making them even more similar to the Greek island style. And just to make things even more interesting, Hlalu tower design seems to be inspired by these ancient, mostly Persian towers, known as Badgir, or wind catchers. Another bonus point when it comes to Hlalu style are the plantations in the Ascadian Isles. They do look good, adding a peaceful pastoral element and serve as a good transition, especially when surrounding urban areas, like in the case of Suran. And I really like Suran's location, with a gorgeous view on the lake Masobi. Moving on, we have House Redoran, which I have to say right away is my personal favorite. Now, in-game, House Redoran has a misfortune of being located in a barren and ash-storm-ridden regions of Wardenfell, just east of Red Mountain. Seat of House Redoran, Aldrun, meaning Old Home, has daily ash storms, so good luck on visiting on a clear sunny day. Now, why is Redoran my favorite Dunmer architecture, at least among those found in-game? From the outside, it's one of stylistically more iconic designs. Redoran settlements are built of local material, and their exterior almost blends in with the landscape, as it's inspired and sometimes built by the shells of giant native insects. Most prominent and iconic example of Redoran architecture is definitely Underscar, also known as Manor District. This huge structure is in fact a shell of a prehistoric emperor crab called Scar, and its giant shell was incorporated into the city of Aldrun. Underscar is not so much of a building as it's a city within a city, housing not only large manors of all Redoran leaders, but also several shops and even a guild hall. I always imagine it as a large prehistoric mall. I also believe that in real life scale, Underscar could probably host hundreds if not thousands of people. In fact, Underscar is the largest interior space in the entire game, making Aldrun much bigger than it actually looks from the outside, with more NPCs than Balmora. Almost all Redoran buildings are actually set underground, with small outside structures serving basically as entrance covers, which leads me to my next segment. The real reason why I simply love Redoran, besides its warrior and honor-oriented culture, is the atmosphere and feeling I get every time I walk the streets of Aldrun or go inside one of the manors. First of all, it always makes me feel like I'm on some weird alien planet within a sci-fi story, for example Dune or even Star Wars. There is a prevalent sense of approaching apocalypse, especially with the perpetual red blight storms blowing endless amounts of dirt into face, as well as spreading deadly soul sickness. Face covers are required, or any kind of protection from the storm and dirt. Now, this highly violent, unpredictable exterior is contrasted with silky and baroque interiors of large space and open multi-staircase rooms richly decorated with cushions, tapestries, rugs, geometric patterns styled into ceilings. There are private rooms divided by paper walls used for conversation, prayer, or simple relaxation, as well as many native plants grown for aesthetical or alchemical purposes. Everything seems elegant and deeply rooted in proud history, so much for the supposed Redoran austerity, which seems to be limited only for the exterior. And finally, we have Telvanni style, which reflects the ideals of isolationism and eccentricity of the Telvanni lords. This is by far the most alien architectural style found on Wardenfell. Telvanni settlements are in fact organic structures sustained by powerful magic. Each Telvanni settlement has a central main tower. Now, a little known fact is that the central or main tower is the source of all surrounding buildings, as they are simply its extensions. So in other words, entire Telvanni settlement is a one giant organism. And because of this, Telvanni lord could easily cut off a tendril and basically destroy anyone's home. This just goes to show the extent of control that Telvanni lords have over every citizen living in their territory. The process of creating, growing, and shaping Telvanni structure is complex and relies not only on arcane knowledge, but also requires basics of architecture and mycology. Through the knowledge of architecture, Telvanni wizard will know which shape are most appropriate for the living according to the surrounding terrain, and mycology is vital for dealing with the growth of fungus. Wardenfell is mostly inhospitable, but Telvanni fungus prefer the conditions of eastern coastlines, where rocky shores meet the salt water of the seas. Largest Telvanni structure is said to be in their capital, Port Telvannis, which is not seen in the vanilla game since it's in the mainland. A true marvel of Telvanni architecture, it towers above the rest of the city. City's roots are deeply anchored in the soil, and most of the structures are carved out of the massive chutes of the central tower high above the ground, giving the city a truly otherworldly appearance, with streets that are many feet up into the air. Telvanni fungus has many beneficial aspects as well. For example, it has limited capacity of removing salt from water, making it drinkable for both man and mer. It also absorbs moisture, so it's highly resistant to fire. And due to its organic nature and because it's sustained through magic, it doesn't require any maintenance. Towers are shaped by their masters into various organic, tree-like forms and often serve as a visual representation of their power, regional dominance, as well as independence. This particular style is also, in my opinion, most aggressive looking. There is a definite sense of danger and peculiarity hiding behind a sinister creativity typical for rogue Telvanni wizards. The interior architecture is very different compared to the other great houses, and it is my least favorite. It isn't because Telvanni towers require levitation to reach main chamber. In general, I find navigating through them quite tiring, as I often find myself stuck in one of those really narrow tunnels, often bumping my head as I move up and down. And everything feels uninviting, my guess is intentionally. Even I dislike Telvanni architecture, I love that's in the game, and Morrowind will never be the same without it. I do like large purple crystals found inside the main towers, and these are actually remnants of the solar gems used to grow towers, twisted and changed to Telvanni magic in symbiosis with the fungus. They have a pleasant, warm presence, and I wish there's more of them around. So this was a more general overview of the architecture found among the three great houses. And while Telvanni is really a unique style on its own, we can draw some parallels between the Hlaalu and Redoran. For once, both favor brown-yellow colored covering, regardless of building material. And I think that both have a subtle connection to the former nomadic lifestyle, especially the Redoran style. You see, great houses represent a civilizational step forward, in which Dunmer, at least most of them, abandoned the nomadic lifestyle found even today among the Ashlander tribes. These nomads lived in huts, and certain architectural choices like arched doorways, which are found regularly in both Hlaalu and the Redoran styles, perhaps mimic ancestral nomadic aesthetics, and especially the Redoran structure with irregular domes and tiny windows. They can be viewed as a modernized version of the traditional yurt. On the other hand, Hlaalu goes another step further towards the modernization, avoiding the underground dwelling and, instead, often adding a second floor. And Hlaalu's straight lines and cubic forms are almost certainly due to limited space in an urbanized lifestyle that they seem to prefer. Now, scattered across Vvardenfell are also Velotti towers, mostly found in isolated, out-of-the-way places. These are in fact remnants of the ancient Velotti culture. In fact, many of the modern Dunmer architectural styles are in some way inspired by the Velotti, and especially temple structures or the tribunal temples. They most likely originate during the High Velotti period, when the Chimera first settled in Resdayn, with Chimera of course being the golden-skinned ancestors of Dunmer. These days, Velotti towers remain largely abandoned or occupied by the members of House Telvanni. Some towers even end up hosting necromancers, like Tower of Vas. As for the original purpose of Velotti towers, I believe that they were religious objects. They are characterized again by arched doorways and dome-shaped roofs that are easily visible from afar, something that is quite useful in Morrowind's hostile and difficult to navigate landscape. This traditional style, as we said, clearly influenced Tribunal Temple, but also Vivec City, which is again considered a holy place. There isn't much else to be said about the Velotti architecture, since all we have left are these remote towers, abandoned at least since the late Meretic era, or their modernized replicas. But they seem to be inspired by Sumerian architecture, with maze-like interiors decorated with sacred texts and ancestral motifs. Sumerian and specifically Babylonian culture has a major influence in shaping Morrowind's overall aesthetics, so that's not a big surprise. Now, there is a lot to be said about Vivec City, practically a capital of Vvardenfell. The city is a collection of 9 artificial islands called cantons, and each canton is made up of a large multi-tiered building the size of a small town. Needless to say, it's a huge place and can be quite intimidating, especially for new players. There are numerous bridges and walkways connecting the cantons, creating a real gigantic maze that is somewhat difficult to navigate. Water is ever present even in interiors. Small boats called gondolas, each operated by the gondolier, provide the means of cheap and short distance travel between the cantons, adding a certain Venetian charm to the place. In my opinion, best thing about Vivec is that it truly feels like a magical fantasy city and not just some random medieval town. Design may be confusing, but only at first. Once you get used to it, it's actually quite immersive and fun, and you are free to enjoy true wonders of this timeless location. Now, this could be just my impression, but I also see a bit of futurism in Vivec's design, in a way that it comes from a really distant future where technology transcends into magic. Even besides all these real-life historical influences that help design the city, I guess it's the architectural symphony of symmetry and geometry, of perfectly aligned cyclopean pyramid-shaped structures ornated with banners depicting religious figures in almost scientific way, complemented by omnipresent inverted triangles and those wide, mighty bridges, high above the sea level. If we just replaced game textures with something modern and added, let's say, neon lights, Vivec could easily become a dystopian, cyberpunkish metropolis. Another thing worth mentioning is that in Vivec everything is set inside, including plazas and countless shops, taverns and guild halls, making again a unique atmosphere. As for the real-life influences, it's widely agreed that Vivec is at least partially based on the city-state of Tenochtitlan, a capital city of Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan was built on an island and was also divided into different zones connected via bridges and boats. My guess would be that Vivec is a mixture of Aztec and Babylonian influences. For instance, Vivec's palace is somewhat reminiscent of a Babylonian ziggurat. And for the end of this chapter, we're gonna cover a couple of more architectural styles, specifically the enigmatic Dunmer strongholds and a sample of House Indoril style found in Morrowind. Massive stone fortresses, known simply as Dunmer strongholds, are veiled in secrecy, as it's not really known when they were built or for what purpose. They are also unlike any other Dunmer structure, making them even more enigmatic. A popular belief is that they were used in a war against the Nords or maybe even Dwemer many millennia ago. However, it's also confirmed by game developer Gary Noonan that they were basically fortified checkpoints or hotels for travelers. There are no records of any of the strongholds being held under siege or used in actual war, but it's possible that they were used by wandering warriors as layover posts. Each stronghold has a large, almost ceremonial stairway leading up onto a massive platform with a few buildings or chambers on top of it. There are narrow, slit windows, I believe they're also called arrow slits, used for obvious defensive purposes. Most strongholds are quite distant from any civilized areas and use a sophisticated travel system via propylon chambers. This requires a deep arcane knowledge that was apparently common during the High Velocity era, or at least during the early Chimer years, but was lost later on. Because of this, it's safe to assume that these strongholds were built during those periods. In fact, it is believed that High Velocity culture had a well-developed, a rather unique form of magic known as technomancy, or a technological magic. Same one that was later on used by Sota Sil. It allowed a fast travel via organized system of portals all across the land. As Chimer changed into Dunmer and descended into the nomadic tribalistic society, this technology faded away. Fortresses are however incredibly well preserved, no wonder due to Velocity being very highly advanced, and even today they serve as a reminder of a distant and glorious past of Dunmer's ancestors. And lastly, in Morrowind's first expansion pack Tribunal, we have a chance to visit the sacred city of Amalexia, specifically its innermost temple called Mournhold. There is a recurring quote spoken by almost every guard.
Mournhold, city of light, city of magic.
Reminding us that we are truly in a place of a very special and unique nature. What can be said about Mournhold's architecture? It has a very different style compared to the styles found on Vardenfell. Mournhold feels ceremonial and imbued with strange, forbidden magic. No surprise, as it houses the High Chapel, home to Amalexia, one of the living gods of the Tribunal Temple. This Mournhold is in fact new, built relatively recently by the orders of Amalexia. Overall architectural style is intricate, colorful, and reflects all the splendor of House Indoril and the glory of Divine Queen Amalexia. Well, at least in her mind. Architecture is meant to impress and intimidate. In many ways, I feel that Mournhold, and probably the city of Amalexia as a whole, represents the high point of a late and decadent era of the waning tribunal. Sort of a creative dead end. There's nowhere to go from here except back into the Dark Age. And this indeed happened soon after the events of Morrowind. All the luxury and beauty is a facade covering that theocratic menace ruled by a deranged, self-proclaimed goddess, and strictly enforced by the vigilant and stoic High Ordinators.
Watch yourself. We'll have no trouble here.
There are obvious Eastern influences, and in my opinion they are mostly Chinese. For once, one of the Mournhold's dominant colors, besides white, is jade. Middle Eastern, Islamic influences are also obvious, particularly in patterns found on doors and windows. And there's again the green color. I'm also reminded of a Moorish architecture in South Spain. The usage of spires is interesting and quite unique for Morrowind, and they are somewhat similar to the spires found in Cheydinhal, a city in Cyrodiil that is, as we previously mentioned, influenced by Dunmer architecture. In conclusion, I think that Mournhold's obvious architectural syncretism reflects cosmopolitan tendencies, perhaps led by a desire to alienate from the rest of the Morrowind, in order to look and feel different. I also have to mention all the cherry blossom trees and gardens, adding to the formal and ritualistic aesthetic of Mournhold. And I should also mention that Mournhold is the only city that has street lamps, creating a really wonderful magical atmosphere at night. It is a city of lights, after all. And finally, we have Daedric and Dwemer ruins. Daedric ruins were most likely built by Chimer, who were instructed by Boeotia in the art of so-called responsible architecture. Now, Daedra worship was nothing new in those times, however, it's interesting to know that most of the Daedric ruins are dedicated to the House of Troubles, a collective name given by Dunmer to the group of Daedric princes that were banned from official worship. One possible explanation would be that the good Daedra were worshipped in the official Velothi temples, perhaps in Velothi towers, leaving the heretical cults of the House of Troubles to build those blasphemous temples across Morrowind. Stylistically, Daedric ruins emulate the so-called Daedric style, not really a surprise there, consisting of highly irregular shapes and twisted towers with ornamental, menacing-looking spikes. Design purposefully encapsulates chaotic and violent nature that is typically associated with the Daedra. As a matter of fact, design of these ruins is so otherworldly that they look somehow warped, as if breaking the rules of reality, and at the same time serving as the gates of oblivion, summoning free-roaming Daedric creatures that are often found nearby. They always reminded me of small pockets of oblivion transported to Tamriel, and each shrine also contains a large statue dedicated to the Daedric prince. Now, some of the shrines used to be cities, and such is the case of Al Sota, birthplace of Sota Sil. It was destroyed by Mehrunes Razor, and eventually a shrine to him was built on the exact spot. However, I always wondered whether these ruins are indeed ruins, meaning a reduced or decayed remains of structures that originally looked different, or is what we see in fact the original design, because there are walls, columns, and staircases randomly dispersed around in seemingly irrational way, as if they are arranged without any coherent design. And finally, we come to Dwemer ruins. They are generally regarded as leftovers of underground cities and strongholds of the Dwemer, and they are quite common in Morrowind, especially on Wardenfell due to the location of the heart of Lorkhan. Within these ruins, one can find factories, research labs, and various service facilities, suggesting that these were maybe more industrial complexes instead of actual permanent cities, as the living quarters are quite few. With that said, we should also consider game engine limitations, especially for that time, for not allowing developers to realize fully functional living and breeding cities with adequate living areas. Therefore, I think that Dwemer ruins in particular are severely limited in their scope, ending up as a mere simple linear dungeons for players to run through and loot. In any case, it's safe to conclude that Morrowind's Dwemer ruins are based on metal and steam, They are easily recognized from afar by their tall, curved-shaped central towers with small spires on top. These towers, with domes, have a slight similarity with Indian architecture, but I am not sure if there was any direct influence. Dwemer culture is generally thought to be influenced by Mesopotamian civilizations, especially Assyrian, although their architectural style not as much. I especially love beautifully crafted long bridges built over fire rivers or foyadas, which run down from the Red Mountain. Well, there you have it. This was my general take on Morrowind's architecture. Maybe not a very fun topic compared to the usual mysteries, but I really want to talk about it. As always, thank you guys for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you next time.